Not all mysteries are buried in books. Some are whispered by the people sworn to protect our forests. Tonight, at Bound in Fear, we uncover chilling real incidents reported by park rangers and jungle police. Cases they still refuse to talk about in public. What you're about to hear isn't just a story, it's a warning. So before we begin, make sure you subscribe, because every night we bring you the encounters others are too afraid to share. Now, let's step into the dark. Story 1: The Vanishing Village. Fear doesn't always hide in haunted houses. Sometimes it waits in the silence of the forest, in the reports of rangers and jungle police who swore they'd never speak of what they saw. These are not campfire tales. These are real incidents, documented by the very people trained to protect us. Welcome to Bound in Fear, where every night we uncover the encounters others are too afraid to share. If you're brave enough to keep listening, make sure you subscribe now, because here the darkness has no end. Tonight's story is about a village, a place that appears only when the sun goes down deep in the mountains. Rangers went searching. Some never came back. The few who did refused to talk about it. Until now. It began with a routine missing persons report. A young couple, tourists from out of state, had been exploring the Black Pine Mountains when they disappeared without a trace. Their vehicle was discovered neatly parked at a trailhead, locked, untouched. A cooler full of fresh food sat inside, drinks still cold, everything suggesting they intended to return quickly, but they never did. Their families reported them missing, and a search was launched. As a ranger assigned to that district, I had dealt with my share of hikers who underestimated the terrain, injuries that turned into rescue missions, and tragically, the occasional body recovery. But something about this case felt different, as though a weight hung in the air before we even set out. The first sign came the following evening. Dispatch received a call from a distressed man who claimed he had seen the couple alive. His voice shook as he described them, sitting by the fire in the village. When asked to clarify which village he meant, he stammered and muttered something about it. Not supposed to be there, only showing up at night. Then the line went dead. At first, everyone thought it was a prank. But then came more reports, all eerily similar. Campers claimed to see lantern lights deep in the forest, glowing windows of cabins, faint music drifting through the trees. Some said they saw figures moving in the distance, as though an entire settlement had come alive in the dark. The Black Pine Mountains had no such village. No permanent settlement had existed there in over a century. Still, rumors spread quickly, and with tourists already frightened, my supervisor organized a team to investigate. There were 3 of us: myself, Officer Ruiz from the local police department, and an older ranger named Haskins, a man with more years in the backcountry than anyone I knew. He carried himself with a quiet heaviness, as if he already suspected what we might find. We set out just before dusk, our packs loaded with standard gear, radios checked, flashlights ready. The forest greeted us with unsettling silence. Normally the mountains would be alive with birds, insects, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. That evening the woods were still, almost suffocating. Every step of our boots on the dirt path sounded too loud, too sharp. After an hour of hiking, Ruiz finally broke the silence, trying to sound confident. "Tell me you guys don't buy into this crap," he said. "Ghost villages? People seeing lanterns? It's just stories." But none of us answered. Even Haskins, usually quick with a sarcastic remark, just kept walking, eyes fixed on the trail ahead. The sun vanished behind the ridges, and darkness fell with startling speed. That was when we saw the glow. At first it looked like campfires, small flickers of orange through the tree line. But as we crept closer, the light sharpened into clear shapes. Lanterns hanging from posts, windows glowing warmly, smoke drifting lazily from chimneys. And then we saw it fully. A village, Cabins lined a cobblestone street, their wood weathered but sturdy, doors open, lamps glowing inside. At the center stood a wide square with a large fire pit, flames flickering high. The air carried the scent of wood smoke and cooked meat. And faintly, impossibly, there were sounds. Laughter, music, voices drifting as though an unseen celebration was underway. My stomach knotted. I knew every square mile of these mountains. There was no record, no permit, no trace of anything like this. Yet there it was, standing before us in the night. We stepped cautiously into the square. My flashlight beam cut across wooden benches and stacked barrels. The fire roared in the center, but no one stood near it. The voices seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Carter, our supervisor, called out loudly, "Hello? Is anyone here?" His voice cracked against the stillness, and for a heartbeat the whispers ceased. Then they returned louder, closer. I moved toward one of the cabins and peered through the window. What I saw made my chest tighten. The interior was furnished, old but intact. Wooden chairs, a table set with dishes, even steaming food on the plates. But there were no people. My light caught movement for just a second, the shadow of someone crossing the room, but when I blinked, the place was empty. Ruiz swore under his breath. "We shouldn't be here. This isn't right." He wasn't wrong. Every instinct in me screamed to leave, but then we saw them. The missing couple. They sat on a bench near the fire, holding hands, staring into the flames as if in a trance. Their faces were calm, their bodies relaxed. Relief and dread crashed over me at once. Carter shouted their names and rushed toward them. But as soon as he stepped into the square, the fire vanished. The entire village plunged into darkness. My flashlight stuttered, and when it steadied, the couple was gone. Where glowing cabins had stood seconds before, only rotting ruins remained. The structures were collapsed, beams broken, moss covering the stones. The square was nothing more than a clearing of weeds and damp earth. The air smelled of rot, not smoke. It was as if the village had aged 100 years in an instant. We regrouped, shaken, voices low. Haskins bent to examine the rubble and unearthed something wrapped in oilcloth. It was a leather-bound journal, its pages yellow and brittle but still legible. He read aloud passages written by a miner who had once lived there in the 1800s. The entries spoke of prosperity at first, silver found in the mountains, cabins built, families growing. But then the tone darkened. Livestock vanished. Children heard voices in the night. Neighbors walked into the woods and never returned. The final entry was scrawled in desperation. The mountain demands payment. Tonight it takes us all. Before we could process the words, the sounds returned. Whispers at first, then laughter. Boots clattering on cobblestone that no longer existed. My flashlight shook as I swept it across the ruins. Nothing. And then, impossibly, the village was back again. Cabins whole, fire blazing, windows glowing, and there was the couple once more seated by the flames. Only this time when they looked up, their eyes were black voids reflecting the firelight. They raised their hands and waved. My blood turned to ice. This was no rescue. This was a trap. We backed away slowly, but the village shifted around us, the paths warping, every turn leading us deeper in. Shadows flitted through windows. Faces peered from doorways only to vanish when confronted. The journal slipped from Haskins' hands, its pages scattering in the wind. Ruiz clutched his pistol, muttering prayers. The voices grew louder, overlapping, chanting in a language none of us knew. Then Ruiz screamed. He spun toward the tree line, firing shots into the dark. We all saw it then. A figure standing between the trees, tall and impossibly thin. Its limbs too long, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. The moment our lights hit it, it retreated, melting into the forest. But the sense of being surrounded only grew stronger. We ran. The paths twisted, cabins flickering between whole and ruined. as if reality itself couldn't decide what was true. The couple appeared again and again, sometimes ahead of us, sometimes behind, always smiling, always waving with those empty eyes. Ruiz stumbled and fell, his screams echoing as the ground seemed to swallow him whole. We tried to grab him, but his body was simply gone, leaving only churned earth. Haskins dragged me forward, forcing me to keep running. When we finally burst from the tree line into the cold moonlight, the village was gone. Behind us only forest. No cabins, no fire, no ruins. Just silent, endless trees. Ruiz was gone forever. Carter and Haskins refused to speak about what happened, writing the report as a failed rescue with no findings. The journal disappeared from evidence, and I was left with memories that wake me every night. Because sometimes, when the wind is still and the mountains are dark, I swear I see lights flickering in the distance. I hear laughter carried on the breeze. And in my dreams, I see the couple waving at me from the fire, their black eyes glistening, inviting me to sit and stay a while. And I know one day, if I follow those lights again, I'll never come back. Story 2. Signal in Sky. The night air was thick and cold, pressing down on the forest as though it wanted to squeeze the breath from anyone who dared enter. Ranger Daniel Rowe had been on patrol in the northern wilderness for nearly a decade, and he prided himself on keeping calm in any situation, but this night felt different from the start. The wind was unnaturally silent, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath, and even the occasional distant howl of a wolf seemed muted. He adjusted the radio strapped across his shoulder, static crackling faintly in the earpiece. Normally this was routine check-ins, reports of minor disturbances, nothing more, but tonight the static began to hum low and insistent, like the vibration of 1,000 invisible wires vibrating through the dark. He paused, hands tightening on the straps of his backpack, and then it came. A voice, distorted but unmistakably human, buried beneath the white noise. "Do you hear me?" It said, soft, almost pleading. "Is anyone there? Please respond. I am lost." Rowe froze. The word sent a shiver down his spine, not because of what they were, but because of the certainty behind them. This wasn't a random interference. It was deliberate. His mind raced through explanations. Another ranger messing with the frequency. A prank from some local ham radio enthusiast. But nothing fit. He keyed the microphone, introducing himself carefully, identifying as a ranger offering help. There was no response. Only the voice repeated, unchanging, looping endlessly. "Do you hear me? Is anyone there? Please respond. I am lost." Shaking, Rowe tried to remember what he had been taught about radio signals in the wilderness. Nothing in his training explained hearing a voice so clearly, so human, yet so impossibly far away. By the next night, the voice returned, louder, insistent. He wasn't alone this time. Officer Ruiz, a young police officer assigned to assist with forest patrols, had joined him. The static erupted in bursts as they both listened in disbelief. "I can see the lights," the voice said this time, more urgent, almost distressed. "But they are not mine. I was told this would be safe. I was told this sky belonged to us, but it is not our sky anymore." Rowe glanced at Ruiz, whose hands trembled slightly on his flashlight. The voice, calm but unnerving, named itself as Lieutenant Carter, referencing an expedition labeled 49B and a year, 2236, a date far in the future, far beyond comprehension. "If anyone hears this, tell them we were wrong," the voice warned. "Tell them it is already here." Then silence swallowed the forest again, leaving only the sound of the wind rustling through the skeletal branches. Over the following week, the transmissions escalated. They occurred every night, always at precisely the same time. Always with voices that sounded human, but spoke of things entirely alien. Coordinates that didn't exist, stars with names unknown, warnings of entities beneath glaciers, cities that moved silently in the darkness. One transmission said, "You are the Watchers. You must keep the gates closed. Do not let them in." Ro's nights became sleepless. He sat alone in the ranger tower, tuning frequencies, scribbling notes, his eyes bloodshot, obsessed with every nuance of the static, every whisper, every pulse of distorted human sound. The forest seemed to pulse along with the signals, the trees swaying as though alive, shadows shifting in ways that defied logic. The longest and strangest transmission came during a violent thunderstorm. Rain pounded the tower roof in sheets, lightning slicing the sky, illuminating the forest in jagged, ghostly flashes. The radio blared with a clarity that made Ro's teeth ache, and the voice was different. Urgent, panicked, almost pleading. "They are here! The sky is bleeding. Do not trust the lights. Do not follow the music. If you hear the music, run." The static surged, almost violent, making the air around the tower vibrate. Ro grabbed the mic, his voice cracking as he demanded answers, his words swallowed by the storm. And then came a scream through the earpiece, high-pitched, mechanical, distorted beyond recognition, echoing through his bones. Then silence again. Minutes later, the station phone rang. Campers in the valley below reported hearing faint music in the forest, violins playing a mournful, hypnotic tune that seemed to come from everywhere at once. There were no other camps in the area. Ro's pulse raced. He felt the words of the transmission settle into his mind like a warning etched in ice. Do not follow the music. But he did. He hiked into the storm, through mud-soaked trails and slippery rocks, every nerve alert. The melody drew him deeper, always just ahead, always distant yet perfectly clear. Each note seemed to vibrate in his chest, his bones, tugging at something buried deep in the subconscious. The forest around him changed as he advanced. Trees loomed impossibly tall, their trunks twisting unnaturally. Shadows moved independently of the wind. The rain seemed thicker, heavier, slowing his steps as if the forest itself was resisting his approach. Then he saw it, a clearing bathed in a pale blue light, the source of the music. Towers of metal arranged in a perfect circle hummed faintly, each pulsing in time with the eerie melody. The music emanated from within, a harmony too precise to be natural, and yet impossibly organic, like something alive. In the center of the circle stood figures, human-shaped but blurred at the edges, their features indistinct, faces shivering as if caught in a heat wave. Ro's flashlight trembled in his hands. The figures turned toward him slowly in unison, their eyes glowing white. The radio in his pack erupted with static, a whispery chorus layered over the mechanical scream from earlier. And then a single voice, softer now, clearer than anything else, whispered directly in his mind, "Now you hear us. Now you belong to us." He stumbled backward, rain slicking rocks tearing at his boots. Panic clawed at him as the figures advanced. But when he tripped, they didn't move closer, only watched. The music grew louder, an impossible symphony that seemed to warp the air itself. He scrambled up, running blindly through the trees, following the faintest path of light. The forest stretched impossibly around him, trails looping back, turning into the same clearing over and over, until his mind could no longer trust what he saw. Hours later, or maybe minutes, time had lost meaning. He emerged alone on a ridge overlooking the valley. The clearing, the towers, the figures, the music, they were gone. Rain still fell, but the forest was silent, empty and normal, as if none of it had ever existed. Only his radio remained, static now harmless, a single piece of proof that might be dismissed by anyone who hadn't heard it. Ro's heart still raced, his fingers shaking as he wrote the first lines in his logbook. They are not of this time. They speak to us. They are waiting. By the next morning, dispatch filed a missing person report for Ro. He had gone back to the forest at dawn, following the signals, chasing the music. His fellow rangers searched for him for days, but he was never found. All that remained was the radio, lying face up in the clearing where the blue light had been, humming faintly with static that no one could tune out. Since then, rangers in the district report occasional bursts of unexplained signals, distorted voices calling for help, strange music, the same warnings from Lieutenant Carter. Some claim they've seen flashes of blue light deep in the forest at night, or shadowy figures between the trees that vanish when approached. The signals have persisted for decades, always at night, always near the tower, always reaching only those who listen too long, those who think they can resist the pull. And the music, it continues, faint and insistent, a lure to anyone who dares to answer, promising knowledge, promising safety, promising nothing but disappearance. Those who claim to have been drawn in say the forest itself seems alive, the air heavy with anticipation, the shadows not cast by trees but by something unseen, following, always watching. Some disappear entirely, leaving only logs, radios, and cryptic warnings in their wake. The few who return are never the same. They speak of stars that do not exist, of voices that know their names, of music that crawls under the skin and lingers even after they leave the forest. Every winter, when the nights grow long and the winds carry the sound of ice across the ridges, the signal returns and those who are listening can hear it. The forest waits. It always waits. Story 3, The Lost Patrol of Black Hollow. The forest of Black Hollow had always been whispered about among rangers, a place where the canopy grew so dense that sunlight barely touched the forest floor, and shadows seemed to move of their own accord. Patrols were routine, yet every ranger knew to never linger too long after dark. That night, a team of 3 rangers, Mason, Tully, and Andrews, was sent on a late patrol to check on a series of ranger cabins deep within the hollow. The mission was simple: verify the security of the area and ensure no poachers had entered. But as they drove their jeep along the dirt road that wound like a snake through the dense trees, an uneasy feeling settled over all 3 men. The forest seemed unnaturally silent, the usual rustling of nocturnal animals absent. Even the wind, which normally swept through the branches, was eerily still. By the time they reached the trailhead, darkness had swallowed the path. Their flashlights barely penetrated the gloom, illuminating the gnarled roots and jagged rocks. Mason led the way, his radio periodically crackling with check-ins to the main station. Everything was normal, or as normal as Black Hollow ever was. They began their patrol, walking along the path that twisted into the heart of the forest, every step stirring damp leaves and moss. Minutes turned into hours, and the forest seemed to shift around them. Familiar landmarks disappeared, replaced by thick underbrush and trees that hadn't been on any map. Tully paused, crouching to inspect strange markings on a tree trunk. They looked like claw scratches, but unnaturally deep, almost deliberate, as if the tree itself had been wounded. "That's new," he muttered, shining his flashlight across the surrounding woods. Mason frowned, moving closer. "Probably bears," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Andrews, who had been silent since entering the hollow, shifted uneasily. "I don't like this," he admitted. "It's too quiet." "Too perfect." They continued along the path, trying to shake off the feeling that they were being watched. Soon, faint whispers began to drift through the trees, soft, unintelligible, carried on the wind. Mason called out, "Hello? Who's there?" The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by silence that pressed in on them from every direction. It was impossible to tell where the sound had come from, and when they tried to move forward, the path seemed to stretch endlessly, each bend revealing nothing familiar. Their flashlights flickered, as if the darkness itself was trying to push back. Hours passed. The men grew anxious, their radios now crackling with static so thick it was almost a roar. Then, just beyond a cluster of twisted oaks, they saw it. A faint glow, orange and wavering like firelight. Mason led the way toward it, convinced it was one of the cabins. As they drew closer, the glow resolved into a small campfire, perfectly arranged, surrounded by empty tents. Smoke rose lazily, curling into the night sky. Yet there was no heat, no warmth, only the eerie illumination. Approaching the fire, Andrews noticed something odd. Footprints circling the clearing, but none leading in or out. The prints were human, adult-sized, but they repeated in a perfect loop, as if someone or something was walking endlessly in place. Mason called out, "Anyone here?" "Rangers checking in." The only response was the crackle of the fire, snapping as though it were breathing. Then the whispers returned, closer now, threading through the trees like invisible fingers. Suddenly Tully screamed. Shadows flitted between the trees, moving too fast, too fluidly for human legs. Mason swung his flashlight toward them, catching glimpses of tall, thin figures hunched low, watching then disappearing behind trunks. The men froze. Their radios erupted in a chorus of overlapping voices, screaming in unison, shouting their names in tones both human and impossible. Mason grabbed Tully, who was shaking violently, while Andrews shone his light in every direction. The shadows reappeared in the beams impossibly close, yet when they blinked they were gone. Panic set in. The men ran blindly through the hollow, branches slashing their faces, roots tripping their feet, every path seeming to loop back to the same clearing with the campfire. The fire remained perfectly centered, smoke still curling, the whispers circling around them, mocking, laughing. Mason realized with a sinking heart that the forest was alive and it was playing with them, bending space to trap them inside its grasp. Tully screamed again as a figure stepped from the shadows. It looked human at first glance, tall, uniformed, but its face was hidden beneath a mask of bark and vines, features shifting and twitching unnaturally. Its hands were elongated, tipped with black claws that scraped against the stones and roots. Mason fired his flashlight at it, but the beam passed through like mist, leaving the figure intact, moving closer, step by step. Andrews stumbled backward, catching his ankle on a hidden root, falling to the ground. The figure raised its head, and for a brief moment the forest seemed to hold its breath. Then the whispers rose to a scream and the figure lunged. Or perhaps it didn't. Time itself warped. Mason blinked, and when he opened his eyes, Tully and Andrews were gone. The clearing was empty save for the fire, now burning with unnatural blue flames. Mason dropped to his knees, heart hammering, trying to call them over the radio. Static answered him, then voices, soft, beckoning, repeating in perfect synchrony. "Join us. Join us. Stay. Stay." He crawled toward the fire, compelled, every nerve screaming to resist, yet every fiber of his being pulled him forward. The shadows twisted around him, the whispers forming words he could understand. "You cannot leave. We keep the lost. We keep the faithful." Mason stumbled, falling into the firelight, and the world around him shattered. The trees bent inward. The canopy twisted into a vault of darkness, stars above flickering like dying embers. The fire revealed faces, dozens of them, human, some familiar, some not, all with empty eyes and twisted smiles staring directly at him. The whispers became laughter, layered with screams, and the air itself seemed to pulse with malevolent intelligence. He tried to scream, but no sound came. His radio slipped from his hands, broadcasting the echoes of his panic, repeating endlessly, "Do not follow, do not enter. The hollow keeps you." Then everything went black. When search teams arrived the next morning, the forest of Black Hollow was silent, as if nothing had happened. No signs of the Rangers remained, no footprints, no torn foliage, only the faint imprint of the jeep at the trailhead, untouched. The radio Mason had dropped was found, still crackling with static. and occasionally, just faintly, a voice would whisper names: Mason, Tully, Andrews, calling into the empty forest, waiting for someone else to hear, waiting for someone else to follow. To this day, rangers report strange occurrences in Black Hollow, shadows moving independently, whispers carrying names of the missing sudden loops in the trails where the path seems endless. And at night sometimes, a small flickering fire appears in the center of the hollow, as if the forest itself is calling to the next patrol, ready to add them to its collection. Those who claim to have seen it say the flames are blue, cold and impossible to approach, and the forest holds its breath, waiting for the next team to wander too far, too curious, too unafraid of the darkness. Story 4. The Whispers of Devil's Creek. The forest along Devil's Creek had always carried a reputation, whispered in ranger break rooms and local bars, as a place where the trees leaned too close and shadows lingered long after sunset. Ranger Elise Carter had heard the stories all her life, but she dismissed them as superstition, until the night she and her partner, Officer Lang, were dispatched to investigate missing hikers near the creek's bend. The day had been unremarkable, the sun dipping below the horizon in streaks of crimson and gold, and the creek itself glimmered with an innocent shimmer, almost beautiful in its calm. By the time darkness fell, the air had turned damp and cold, pressing against the skin like a warning. The path along the creek was narrow, overgrown, roots and rocks clawing at every step, and a strange stillness hung over the forest that made even the birds silent. Elise led the way, her flashlight cutting through the darkness, while Lang scanned the perimeter with nervous precision. They moved with practiced caution, yet the farther they went, the heavier the air became, thick with the smell of wet earth and decay. Something was off. The creek, usually lively with the sound of flowing water and occasional frogs, was unnervingly quiet, the current almost sluggish, as if the water itself were holding its breath. Then came the whispers, soft, distant at first, carried on a wind that should not have been moving. Elise froze. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Lang nodded, gripping his radio tightly. The words were unintelligible, melodic in a twisted way, rising and falling like a chant from deep inside the woods. They pressed on, moving closer to the area where the hikers had vanished. The forest seemed to respond to them, the trees leaning in, branches forming skeletal fingers, brushing against their shoulders, as if guiding them toward something unseen. Shadows pooled unnaturally in the corners of their flashlights, darker than darkness itself, almost tangible. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, repeating a pattern that made Elise's stomach knot. "Turn back, turn back, turn back." The voices were both human and alien, layered with a resonance that vibrated through the bones, making the forest floor seem to shift beneath their feet. As they rounded a bend, they saw a faint light flickering through the trees. At first it appeared to be a small campfire, but the glow was too pale, almost silvery, and it moved subtly, shifting in position as though alive. Approaching cautiously, Elise noticed footprints leading to the clearing, though the grass had not been disturbed in the way normal tracks would leave. The prints were shallow, almost like they were pressed into existence rather than made by a footfall. Lang raised his flashlight higher, revealing dozens of tiny glimmering lights hovering above the ground, drifting like will-o'-the-wisps, moving in slow, deliberate circles. The whispers had intensified, now coming from all directions, overlapping, speaking names, pleading, laughing in tones both joyous and menacing. Elise's pulse quickened. She recognized one of the hikers' backpacks near the edge of the clearing, lying perfectly still. But as she stepped closer, the air grew frigid, breath freezing in her lungs. The backpack seemed wrong. Its edges wavered like a reflection on water, shifting slightly every time she blinked. Lang touched her shoulder, pointing to the creek where the water shimmered unnaturally. A figure had appeared there, tall, thin, with limbs impossibly long, moving just beyond the reach of their flashlights. Its face was featureless, but Elise could feel its gaze, piercing, alive, aware of every thought in her mind. The whispers rose to a cacophony, a chorus of warnings and demands, overlapping in impossible harmony. They formed words Elise could understand only fleetingly. Do not take the path, the creek keeps what it takes. The lost will call for you. She felt an invisible tug, pulling her toward the figure, toward the water, toward something she could not name. Her body moved despite her mind screaming to resist. Lang grabbed her arm, yanking her back. They stumbled, crashing through underbrush, the whispers chasing them like a storm of sound. The lights above drifting closer, circling in tighter patterns, forming a tunnel of glowing menace. Suddenly, the figure at the creek moved with impossible speed, vanishing and reappearing closer. And with each leap, the forest seemed to stretch, elongating the distance between trees and deepening shadows, warping the space around them. Elise tripped over roots that hadn't been there before, falling into a shallow depression where the earth seemed soft, almost living. She looked up to see dozens of small humanoid shapes emerging from the shadows, their movements jerky, unnatural, heads tilting as they studied her with wide, reflective eyes. They whispered her name in voices borrowed from the missing hikers, voices that begged, threatened, and mocked all at once. Lang shouted her name, waving his flashlight, trying to ward off the swarm. For a moment the figures froze, then let out a chorus of sound so loud and grating it rattled Elise's teeth. She covered her ears, stumbling backward, her eyes catching movement at the creek. The water now pulsed with silvery light, waves rippling upward in defiance of gravity. From the depths more figures emerged, taller than men, thin as reeds, their limbs bending in angles that should have been impossible. Each step they took left ripples in the water, distorting reflections into grotesque shapes that leered, smiled, and whispered simultaneously. Desperation drove Elise and Lang deeper into the forest, losing all sense of direction. The path behind them seemed gone, swallowed by the growing darkness, trees closing ranks as though the forest itself had become a living labyrinth. Every sound, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, felt amplified, yet no creature was visible. The whispers followed them, now directly inside their minds, planting images, memories not their own, lost children calling for help, faces of people long dead staring from the shadows, rivers of water running red beneath the ice. Each vision made them stagger, dizzy with vertigo, unable to distinguish reality from hallucination. They came to a second clearing, larger, dominated by an ancient oak that stretched impossibly high, its trunk hollowed and blackened. At its base, a faintly glowing fire burned, casting long, grotesque shadows. And there, sitting in a circle around the fire, were the missing hikers, motionless, heads tilted, faces blank, their eyes reflecting the same silvery light as the creek. As Elise stepped closer, compelled to investigate, one of the figures moved. A ranger from a previous patrol, long reported missing, stepping toward her with a smile too wide. Eyes empty, voice whispering, "You're next." Panic overtook them. Lang grabbed Elise, dragging her backward, but the forest responded with resistance. The underbrush thickened, vines wrapping around their ankles, roots twisting to trip them. The whispers crescendoed into screams, a symphony of madness that seemed to come from every direction, yet had no source. Figures emerged from the shadows surrounding them, their forms distorted, some human, some not, all watching, waiting. The creek behind them glowed brighter, as if calling, urging them toward the water, toward oblivion. Time lost meaning. Each step forward or back felt endlessly long, the same clearings appearing again and again, the fire always burning in the same place, the missing hiker's eyes always watching. Elise felt her mind fray, hearing her own thoughts repeated in alien cadences, speaking words she had never uttered. Lang screamed, grabbing her hand, trying to force her to run, but the path twisted like a snake, leading them deeper, not out. The forest had become a trap, a predator, and they were prey. Eventually, exhaustion and terror forced them to stop. They pressed back to back in the smallest patch of light they could find, breathing heavily, listening as the whispers slowly receded, leaving only a low, persistent hum that vibrated through the earth. For hours they stayed there, unmoving, until the first pale light of dawn finally pierced the canopy. When they finally rose, the forest seemed normal again, trails clear, trees upright, creek calm and unassuming. The missing hikers were gone. The strange lights, the figures, the whispers, all vanished without a trace. Only the memory remained, raw and gnawing. Months later, reports continued. Rangers patrolling Devil's Creek still see flickers of silvery light over the water at night, hear whispers carrying names of the lost, and sometimes small shapes darting between the trees. Those who have lingered too long describe feeling watched, followed as if the forest remembers the living and waits for the next patrol to stumble, lost into its dark heart. The whispers are patient, persistent, promising nothing but disappearance, and the creek still glows under the moon, calling for the next set of footsteps that will vanish, never to return. Story 5. The Shadow in Ravenwood Forest. Ravenwood Forest had always carried a reputation for swallowing those who ventured too deep. A place where seasoned rangers warned newcomers that the darkness was alive and the trees were not what they seemed. Ranger Jacob Hayes had laughed off the stories when he first arrived, but years on the force had taught him that the forest's reputation was earned. On this particular autumn night, he and his partner, Officer Niles, were called to investigate reports of strange lights and missing hikers along the northern ridge. The sun had barely set when they drove down the winding dirt road that led into Ravenwood. Mist clung to the ground like a living blanket, curling around the tires of their Jeep and rising in pale, ghostly ribbons between the skeletal trees. The air smelled of wet leaves and something darker, faintly metallic, that made Jacob's stomach churn. The first sign that something was wrong came almost immediately. Their radios crackled with static, but beneath it faint whispers drifted, so subtle that Jacob initially thought he had imagined them. But then Officer Niles froze, his flashlight shaking in his grip. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. Jacob leaned forward, straining to listen. The whispering grew louder, layering itself across the static, speaking words neither of them could understand. They sounded human, yet warped, stretched and twisted into tones that made the hairs on the back of Jacob's neck stand on end. The forest seemed to pulse with the sound, and every step they took echoed too loudly, as though the ground itself were watching. They reached the first ridge, a narrow path lined by twisted pines. The darkness seemed thicker here, the trees leaning closer, branches forming claw-like shapes overhead. Shadows pooled unnaturally under the flashlight beams, moving independently, stretching in impossible angles. The temperature dropped sharply, their breath visible in ragged clouds, even though the weather report had promised a mild night. Jacob adjusted his pack, trying to shake off the rising sense of dread. They moved forward, but with each step, the forest seemed to shift, the familiar landmarks disappearing as the path twisted into loops that made no sense. Suddenly, Niles stumbled, pointing toward a faint orange glow through the trees. At first, Jacob thought it was a campfire, but as they approached, he realized the light was suspended above the ground, hovering in the mist like a living ember. The glow pulsed softly, and as they drew closer, the whispers sharpened into words that pierced their minds. "Do not come closer. You are watched. Leave now." Jacob felt a wave of nausea, a physical pull urging him backward, yet something compelled him to step forward. The forest itself seemed alive, the ground shifting subtly beneath their boots, roots rising like serpents to trip them. They entered a clearing and froze. In the center, a figure stood, a silhouette impossibly tall, thin, cloaked in shadows that seemed to writhe like smoke. Its face was hidden, but Jacob could feel eyes upon him piercing through the darkness, seeing every fear, every doubt. Around the figure, the mist swirled, thickening, carrying whispers that now seemed to repeat the names of missing hikers from previous patrols. Jacob's radio emitted a low hum, then bursts of static, through which a distorted voice called his name. He tried to respond, but his voice caught in his throat, swallowed by the oppressive darkness. Niles stepped forward, his flashlight trembling as it illuminated the edges of the figure. What he saw made him stagger backward. The figure's limbs were too long, bending at impossible angles, and its shadow stretched unnaturally across the ground, defying the position of the light. The whispers intensified, overlapping into a low chanting hum that made their bones vibrate. Jacob felt a tug in his chest, like the forest was pulling him toward the figure, bending his will, twisting his perception. The clearing seemed to stretch endlessly, the same trees and mist repeating in a loop that trapped them in space as much as time. They ran, crashing through underbrush, branches slashing their faces, roots tripping them, yet every path led them back to the clearing. The figure remained, sometimes closer, sometimes further away, always watching, always waiting. Jacob's flashlight flickered and died, plunging them into near-total darkness, leaving only the eerie orange glow hovering in the mist. The whispers grew to screams, voices overlapping, calling names, begging, mocking, and threatening all at once. The forest floor shifted as if alive, and Jacob felt his feet sink slightly, caught in unseen tendrils. In a sudden flash, the figure moved closer. Jacob saw the edges of its face, grotesque and featureless, smooth like polished obsidian, reflecting the faint light. Its limbs twisted unnaturally, and each movement was accompanied by a low grinding sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. Niles screamed, tripping over a root, and when Jacob reached to grab him, his hand passed through his partner as though he were a phantom. Panic overtook him. The forest was no longer just a forest. It was a predator, and he was prey. Time became meaningless. Each step forward or back led to the same clearing, the same figure, the same hovering glow. The whispers became voices in his head, repeating his fears, recounting memories, twisting them into visions of despair. Faces of missing hikers appeared in the mist, screaming silently, reaching for him with elongated limbs. Shadows danced across his vision, forming shapes that were human yet impossibly wrong. Limbs bending in unnatural angles, mouths stretching impossibly wide. The orange glow shifted, and Jacob realized it was not a light, but hundreds of small, hovering embers, moving in patterns that formed eyes, staring at him from every angle. The whispers spoke in unison, finally forming words he could understand. Join us. Stay with us. Become part of the forest. His mind screamed to resist, yet he felt drawn forward. The compulsion almost physical, a tugging, pulling, wrapping around his soul. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure lunged, or perhaps it didn't. Jacob was falling, tumbling through a tunnel of darkness and whispers, spinning endlessly, unable to tell up from down. When he hit the ground, dawn had broken. The forest was calm, the mist burned off by sunlight, and everything seemed normal. The clearing was gone, the glow vanished, and there were no signs of Niles or the figure. Jacob's radio, however, lay on the ground, still crackling with faint static. If he listened closely, he could hear a whisper repeating his name, soft and patient, promising nothing but a return to the darkness. Months later, rangers who entered Ravenwood reported strange phenomena. Flashes of orange and blue lights, shadows moving independently, whispers carried on the wind that spoke names, and trails that looped endlessly. Some claimed they had seen tall, thin figures standing between the trees, disappearing when approached. Those who stayed too long in the forest sometimes returned changed, silent, haunted, eyes flickering with the memory of unseen horrors, and the orange glow still appears on the darkest nights, hovering above the forest floor, patient and waiting, calling for the next patrol, the next wanderer, the next soul to vanish. Story 6. The Vanishing of Timber Ridge. Timber Ridge had always been considered one of the most isolated stretches of forest in the region, a place where even seasoned rangers reported an uneasy feeling the moment they entered. Ranger Marcus Lane had spent years patrolling its rugged terrain, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for the events of that autumn. The call came late in the evening. Hikers had failed to check in at the trailhead, and faint tracks suggested they had ventured deep into the ridge. Marcus grabbed his flashlight and radio, paired with Officer Hale, a young recruit who had never spent a night alone in Timber Ridge. Together, they drove along the winding dirt road that cut through dense pines, the headlights illuminating mist that hugged the ground like a living entity. The air smelled of wet earth and decay, and the usual nocturnal symphony, frogs, insects, rustling leaves, was absent, replaced by a heavy silence that pressed against them like a warning. As they reached the trailhead, the forest loomed like a wall, trees bending overhead, branches entwined so tightly that the sky above was barely visible. Their flashlights cut narrow beams through the darkness, revealing twisted roots and jagged rocks. At first, everything seemed routine, tracks leading into the woods, the occasional broken branch, the faint scent of campfires long extinguished. But then Marcus noticed the first anomaly. Footprints in the mud that appeared human at first, but far too large, too elongated, and impossibly deep. They led deeper into the forest, but each step seemed to sink, leaving impressions that felt less like footprints and more like depressions in reality itself. They followed the tracks cautiously, the forest growing denser with every step. The air became colder, unnaturally so, and the mist thickened into a low-hanging fog that wrapped around their legs and clung to their jackets. Shadows pooled unnaturally, stretching in impossible angles, and whispers began to weave through the trees, soft at first, unintelligible, but growing louder with every step. Marcus felt a prickling sensation along his spine, as though unseen eyes were tracking his every movement. Hale glanced nervously at the beams of his flashlight, eyes wide as something flickered in the periphery of his vision, a shadow that moved too fast, a shape too fluid to be human. The tracks led them to a clearing bathed in an unnatural light, pale and silvery, hovering above the ground in a ring that seemed to float in the mist. At first, Marcus thought it was a group of campers, but the clearing was empty, save for a single charred tree stump in the center, emitting faint pulses of light. The whispers became distinct, repeating a pattern of words that crawled into their minds. Leave. You are watched. They remember. The ridge does not forgive. Marcus felt an irresistible pull toward the stump, as if the forest itself were bending reality, drawing him closer. Hale grabbed his arm, shouting, but the voice was almost hypnotic, a low hum vibrating through the bones, impossible to resist. Suddenly, movement stirred at the edge of the clearing. Figures emerged from the mist, tall, thin, with limbs bending at impossible angles. Their faces were blurred, indistinct, yet Jacob could feel their gaze pierce into him, seeing every fear, every memory. Marcus raised his flashlight, but the beams passed through the figures like smoke. They moved closer, silent, fluid, almost weightless. The mist thickened, curling around the ranger's ankles, rising like living serpents. The whispers rose to a crescendo, overlapping, repeating names, pleading, mocking, and demanding all at once. Marcus and Hale tried to retreat, but the forest had changed. Trees had shifted, roots twisting, closing off paths they had just taken. Every trail led back to the clearing, the same hovering light, the same figures watching, patient, waiting. Marcus's heart pounded as the shadows began to twist, stretching into grotesque shapes, mouths opening in silent screams. The light from the stump pulsed, and with each pulse the figures advanced slightly, elongating impossibly, closing the distance without moving in a way that made sense. Hale screamed as one of the figures stepped closer, its form bending unnaturally, limbs cracking at impossible angles, the edges of its face twitching like liquid, reflecting the silvery light. Marcus tried to grab him, but his hands passed through his partner as though he were a phantom. Panic overtook them, a paralyzing terror that rooted Marcus to the spot. The forest seemed alive, bending, twisting, reshaping itself to trap them. Every sound, branches snapping, leaves rustling, distant animal cries, was amplified and distorted, coming from every direction at once. Then Marcus saw them, the missing hikers, kneeling in the mist around the stump, motionless, heads tilted, faces blank, eyes reflecting the same silvery light. He stepped closer, compelled despite every instinct screaming to stop. One of the hikers slowly lifted its head, and Marcus recognized the eyes, not vacant but staring directly into him, speaking without words. "Join us, the forest remembers. You are next." The mist thickened, curling into tendrils that wrapped around his legs, tugging, pulling him toward the stump. The forest itself seemed to pulse in rhythm with the whispers, the light from the stump beating like a heart. Marcus fought to resist, trying to pull Hale along, but time and space had warped. Each step forward or back led to the same clearing, the same hovering light, the same distorted figures. Shadows crawled across the trees, forming impossible shapes, human limbs twisting into animal forms, mouths opening wide without sound, eyes staring where no eyes should be. The whispers invaded their minds directly, planting images of despair, faces of people long dead, rivers of red beneath the ice, stars that did not exist, all calling for them to surrender, to become part of the ridge. Hours or perhaps minutes passed without clarity. Marcus stumbled, falling into a shallow hollow where the mist seemed thicker, almost solid. From the fog, the figures advanced, surrounding him and Hale, a wall of impossible forms that seemed to bend reality around them. The whispers overlapped, creating a cacophony that rattled their very bones. They felt the forest itself pressing down, reshaping the air, warping light and sound, bending their perception until nothing was real except the pull toward the stump, the light, the figures. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the clearing vanished. The forest was normal again. The mist lifted and the silence was complete, almost unnatural. The stump, the figures, the hikers, all gone. Marcus and Hale found themselves at the edge of the trailhead, the jeep intact, as if no time had passed. Their radios were silent, save for a faint static whispering their names. Their minds reeled, unable to process what had occurred. Everything was gone, but the memory remained, raw and insistent. Months later, rangers entering Timber Ridge report flashes of silvery and orange light at night, shadows that move independently, whispers carrying the names of those who vanished, and trails that twist endlessly, looping back into the forest's heart. Some have seen figures between the trees, thin, tall, their limbs bending unnaturally, faces blurred, always watching. Those who linger too long return changed, silent, haunted, eyes flickering with the memory of impossible shapes. Timber Ridge waits, patient and eternal, calling for the next patrol, the next wanderer, the next soul to vanish. Story 8. The Curse of Hollow Pines. Ranger Eli Thompson had patrolled Hollow Pines for nearly 7 years, but the place still gave him an unsettled feeling, especially during the late autumn months when the leaves rotted into the earth and the wind carried strange, unplaceable scents. Locals avoided the old hunting grounds, speaking in hushed tones about the disappearances, the twisted trees, and the curse that lingered. Eli didn't believe in curses. He believed in poachers, wildlife, and human error, but that night, even he felt the cold shadow of something unnatural brush against the edges of his mind. It started with a routine patrol call. A farmer on the outskirts of the park reported missing livestock. Cattle gone without a trace, and the telltale signs of something unnatural. Tracks that didn't match any known animal. Shallow impressions too wide for a human foot. Claw marks that were deep enough to gouge bone. Eli partnered with Officer Rains, a rookie with a reputation for being steady under pressure. Though nervous in Hollow Pines, they set out in the late afternoon, sun dipping below the horizon, painting the forest in bruised oranges and purples. The air was thick with mist, the forest floor soft underfoot, and silence pressing so heavily that even the usual chatter of insects seemed absent. As they followed the tracks deeper into the woods, Eli noticed the trees themselves seemed wrong. Bark peeled in unnatural patterns, twisted into spirals and jagged symbols, some resembling letters from a language he couldn't recognize. The mist thickened, curling around their legs like pale fingers. The tracks led to a clearing, where the soil had been churned into deep furrows, gouges cutting across the earth as if something had been dragged. Rains shivered. "I don't like this," he muttered. Eli nodded silently, unease prickling his skin. This wasn't ordinary animal activity. This was deliberate, calculated, and something far older than any living thing in the forest. That's when they saw it. A cabin, small, dilapidated, leaning to one side as though it were collapsing under its own age. It hadn't been on any map, and Eli was certain he'd patrolled this section dozens of times. Smoke rose from the chimney, curling into the mist, faintly sweet and acrid. The door hung open. Eli signaled Rains to stay back as he approached, flashlight sweeping the interior. The smell hit him first, decay, rot, and something metallic like dried blood. Inside, the cabin was empty, yet signs of habitation were everywhere. Chairs pushed over, dishes broken on the floor, and a journal on the table, open to a page scrawled in frantic handwriting. "The curse is awake," it read. "They take what belongs to the forest. Do not wander, do not sleep, or they will come for you next." A sudden noise made both men spin. A shadow moved across the far wall, impossible to trace with the flashlight. The air grew colder, icy fingers curling around their necks. Rains whispered Eli's name, voice trembling. A low hum began to rise from the floorboards, vibrating through the walls, growing into a chant that was both human and alien. Then the scratching started, faint at first, like claws dragging across wood and metal. The cabin seemed alive, breathing, walls bending ever so slightly, corners stretching, ceiling sagging closer. Eli stepped back, flashlight trembling in his hand. The journal pages flipped on their own, stopping at a page covered in symbols that glowed faintly, a sickly green luminescence. Words formed in his mind, unspoken yet undeniable. "Leave, you cannot stay. They see you." The hairs on his arms stood on end. Rains reached for his radio, but static erupted violently, drowning his voice. And then he heard it, a whisper, soft, feminine, distant yet unmistakable, calling his name. "Rains, come." Eli grabbed him, dragging him toward the door, but the cabin seemed to resist, walls elongating, floorboards stretching under their feet. Outside, the forest had changed. The mist had thickened into a wall, trees bending unnaturally, trunks twisting in impossible angles. Shapes moved within the fog, tall, thin silhouettes with elongated limbs, some standing upright, others crouched unnaturally, all watching, waiting. From the shadows came low chanting, a harmony of voices in unison, speaking in a language lost to time. The men ran, slipping on wet leaves, crashing through underbrush. Yet the forest looped endlessly. Every clearing, every ridge, every tree seemed familiar, yet subtly wrong. The whispers followed them, sometimes calling their names, sometimes mocking, sometimes begging. Then they saw the animals, cattle from the missing farm, grazing silently in the fog, but their eyes were black voids, reflecting no light, and some moved unnaturally, limbs bending at impossible angles. One turned its head fully, its jaw unhinged in a silent scream, and the men bolted past, hearts hammering. Hours, or perhaps minutes, passed. Exhausted, soaked, and terrified, they stumbled into a narrow canyon where the fog was thickest. There the chanting rose to a crescendo. Symbols etched into the canyon walls glowed faintly, the same green luminescence as the journal. The shadowy figures gathered, circling, their whispers merging into a single commanding voice. The forest takes what is owed. You are trespassers. You will join the others. Eli felt a pull at his chest, like invisible hands dragging him toward the canyon, toward the glowing symbols, toward the forest's will. Rain screamed, a piercing primal sound, as one of the shadows extended a clawed limb toward him. But as they fell backward, the world shifted violently. The canyon stretched impossibly, the fog twisting, the trees above curving into a vault of black. The chanting seemed to echo from everywhere and nowhere at once. Time fractured. Shadows flickered between forms, human, animal, something else entirely, and the forest itself seemed alive, bending reality to its design. Suddenly, Eli awoke, alone, on the edge of the ridge. The fog had lifted. The sun rose pale and weak over hollow pines. Rains was gone. The cabin had vanished. There was no sign of the animals, the symbols, the shadows, only the churned earth where the tracks began. But the journal lay at Eli's feet, pages blank now, the symbols gone. Yet he knew the forest remembered. The whispers never fully left his mind, lingering in corners of his consciousness, promising the next patrol, the next trespasser, the next victim. Years later, rangers report strange phenomena in hollow pines, shadows glimpsed at the edge of vision, whispers in the mist calling their names, and glimpses of long-missing hikers, frozen in place, staring with empty eyes. Livestock continues to vanish mysteriously. Tracks appear and vanish in ways impossible to explain. And on cold autumn nights, those brave enough to patrol the area swear the forest hums with a sentient presence, waiting, patient, collecting what it is owed. Hollow Pines does not forgive. Hollow Pines does not forget.